Josh.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. I, as always, love to see a lot of my regulars back with us this evening, and I am freshly back from the Congress of the Sons of the American Revolution. It was an exciting event. We had about 600 members from all over the country joining us, where we talked about many of our initiatives that we're embarking upon as we head towards our 250th anniversary. I am very pleased that this evening we have not one but two authors with us, and I will be introducing our guests this evening shortly. Before I do that, I want to remind everybody that, as before, you can use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions of our authors. And as always, you can always go to historyauthortalks.com, and there will be a link to where you can purchase the book that we're going to be talking about tonight, our guests' books. And seems like I have to mute somebody here. We've got to make sure everybody's muted, please. So I'm just going to look here, everybody. And I would like to also let folks know that I do have one other show coming up in August, but I am going to be taking a few weeks off here because I've got a number of projects that I'm working on. We'll tell you about that last show that's coming up in August at the end of this program. So for right now, I wanted to introduce you to our guests. First, we have Charlene Boyer-Lewis, who is a professor in the history department and the director of American Studies and the director of Women, Gender, and Sexuality program at Kalamazoo College in Kalamazoo, Michigan. She received her PhD from the University of Virginia. She specializes in women's history, family history, the American cultural and social history in the 18th and 19th centuries. She has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Washington Library at Mount Vernon, International Center for Jefferson Studies, American Antiquarian Society, the Library Company, Historical Society of Pennsylvania, among others. In addition to her just released volume, The Women in George Washington's World, which we're going to be talking about tonight, which she co-edited and contributed an essay. She is the author of The Ladies and Gentlemen on Display, Planter Society in Virginia Springs, 1790 to 1860, and Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte, American Aristocrat in the American Early Republic. And her next project is a biography of Margaret Shippen Arnold, the wife of Benedict Arnold, who we will undoubtedly talk about this evening. So first, I'm very pleased to add to our program Charlene Boyer-Lewis. Charlene, it's great to have you with us this evening.
Thanks, Roger. It's good to be here.
Also with us this evening is George Boudreau. He's a cultural historian of early Anglo-America, specializing in the history of Philadelphia, the work of Benjamin Franklin, and public history. He has published extensively. His 2012 book, Independence, A Guide to Philadelphia, explores the sites related to the nation's founding and the diverse people who lived within them. Boudreau was a founding editor of the Journal of Early American Studies, who has won 6 major grants from the National Endowment of the Humanities to educate teachers about Benjamin Franklin in the 18th century. In addition, he's been awarded research fellowships from the historic Jamestown Rediscovery and the Alejandro Institute for Early American History and Culture at Williamsburg, as well as the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, the Library Company of Philadelphia, Winter Tour Museum and Library, the American Philosophical Society, and the David Library of the American Revolution. And in 2019, he was appointed to a 6-month postdoctoral research fellowship at the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. He's currently Padilla teaching fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1998, PhD from Indiana University. He's currently a senior research associate at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. So with all of that, I'm glad to also bring on to the spotlight here, George. Great to see you, George.
Great to see you, Roger, and great to see all these faces popping up, including some old friends I see. So,
well, that's always very nice. Well, as we were just talking in our sort of pre-show here, this book has just come out, "The Women in Washington's World," and I have had the pleasure of reading the work that we're going to be talking about this evening. And I'm very curious, Charlene, why don't you tell us about what were the origins of this book? Where did this come from?
George and I and a host of other scholars were invited to the Washington Library at Mount Vernon to be a part of a symposium that was about women in George Washington's world. And so a number of us spent a couple of really wonderful days at the library and as part of the symposium and heard about lots of different women in George Washington's life. And George tells this story better than I do. After the event was all over, we're still basking in the glow of how wonderfully intellectual that was and just the camaraderie of all of these historians together. We were, sitting around DeVos House. I'm sure some of you have been there. And George said, this should be a book. This should be a book. And I looked at him and I said, definitely, it should be a book. And I got back to Kalamazoo and I called him up and I said, I want to do this with you. We're going to do this book. So it was George's wonderful idea, and I volunteered or forced myself on him, however you want to describe it.
I tell this story ever so slightly differently, and that was the ladies of Mount Vernon are very wonderful hostesses, and there was a lot of beverages as Washington would have improved, and then all of us were seated around a fireplace in this very modern building. And I said, this reads as a book, it comes together. And Charlene was seated almost next to me and was very enthusiastic. And for days afterwards, I thought, how am I going to talk her into co-editing with me? Because I really like to work collaboratively, especially with someone who was a renowned expert in the field, as she is. My first field is not American women's history, hers is. But it certainly it was a story that needed to be published. So there were hundreds of people at that weekend, but I don't know. I don't think we're a bestseller just yet, but gosh, we're getting a lot of talk on Facebook. So that, for me, that's more important.
Well, as someone who has read it, I will, not to jump to the ending, I heartily encourage everyone. There is so much to learn from the articles that you selected. The footnotes alone are a goldmine of literature of women's history during the Revolutionary era. Not only with renowned authors like Mary Beth Norton, but all the primary source materials. I mean, it's so rich. What is the higher ed landscape of women's studies in the Revolutionary era? And more importantly, what can we as citizens do to encourage her story versus history at the elementary and secondary levels?
I'll start with the first one, and then I'll let George take the elementary and secondary ed one. Even though, you mentioned Mary Beth Norton, and of course everybody knows about Linda Kerber too, those two really foundational books that came out in 1980 that really set the stage for anyone who's looking at women in the early republic. And one would have thought that that would have caused this tremendous sea change in the historiography, that once these books were out there and made it abundantly clear how important women were. But it didn't create that sea change. And so what's really exciting about the last I would say 10 years or so, those of us who look at women's history, family history, gender history in this time period, is that there's this whole new wave of scholarship out there, a whole new generation of historians interested in women's experiences that it's just coming out. I mean, and it's a real tidal wave is even a better word, I think. And so there's so many new works coming out on women in the revolution. And SAR had a conference on women in the revolution in Philadelphia that I was a part of, acknowledging, right, this really important new wave coming out in the historiography. But what's interesting about the way historians like myself and others in this book, as well as many, many other who, you know, aren't in this book, I think of like Lauren Duvall, for instance, is the way we've broadened the scope of looking at women's history. And it's really opening up the entire era in new ways with new eyes to incorporate women into the story in order, I would argue, to rewrite the era's history. So that's what's happening. You know, there are lots of scholars involved in this project, lots of women's historians committed to this time period, because it's a wonderful time period. I don't have to convince any of you out there. It's a wonderful time period to examine when lots was up for, many, many, many things were up for discussion. It was very fluid. It was very flexible. Who knew exactly how women were going to play a role in the revolution and in the new nation? So there are lots of questions and avenues that are still rich veins for women's historians to examine. At the elementary and secondary level, George is an expert on that.
Thank you. You know, I guess I'd add an additional nag. I'm looking at the screen, and I love Zoom meetings when you can see who's on and wave at old friends and such. But I'd have to say, if you're a member of the SAR, the DAR, the Colonial Dames, to maybe I'd start off by saying, go through your family lockbox, or go through you know, your filing cabinet. We're still finding women's voices hidden in shoeboxes in family collections. I always think of the anecdote Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who went on to win the Pulitzer and the MacArthur Prizes, said that when she started her dissertation on New England women in the colonial period and said what she was going to work on, archivists looked at her and said, well, you won't find much. And the fact of the matter is she found treasure troves of materials, very often going in and nuancing and using this. And one of the things I've done over the years, and I miss doing with my sadly now gone teaching partner, Carol Baldridge, we ran a series of teachers' workshops that brought, over the course of them, about 500 educators from around the country. And when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, some from around the world, to come and just, as I said, I wanted an immersive humanities experience. And part of that was we looked a lot at Benjamin Franklin, and I still have teachers writing to me saying, it's Ben Franklin Day in my third grade class in Iowa. But it's a way to support and defend the country by getting teachers supported into doing this. I think the National Endowment for the Humanities is one of the greatest institutions in the history of the United States. And if you are a teacher in here, apply next year. And if you want, write to me and I'll proofread your essay. And also support teachers to get into programs like this, or those run by the Gilder Lehrman Institute and others that allow teachers to really get to the stuff. I will always think, we had a situation one year we had a teacher come and she did not bring her medications with her. And by the third day, she was a danger to both us and herself. And at the end of that day, after it escalated, we took the teachers to the Library Company of Philadelphia, which if you haven't been, please find a time to go there. And we'd had to say, we were on alert. The police had put us on alert in this situation. And James Green, who was the longtime librarian there, said to me, oh, George, there's a woman over here in trouble. Is that the teacher? And I said, and I walked up to her and said, you know, we've had kind of a rough day. Can I ask what's going on? And she was sobbing. She was very quietly standing in a corner sobbing. And I said, is there something the matter that I can help you with? And she said, I've spent 40 years teaching public school. I think she was from Michigan, but I could be wrong on that. I spent 40 years teaching government and AP history in Michigan. And you're letting me to hold an original printed copy of the Declaration of Independence.
Wow.
And dedicated George Washington letters. And she wept, and I teared up and took this to Jim Green, who I've teased that he may be a Vulcan. He is not an expressive person, but Jim teared up over this. That, you know, the big thing is to tell these stories is to get folks connected. And if you're very, very wealthy, as I hope all of you are, endow a scholarship. Or if you have an extra 25 bucks, give it to your local historical society. Or if your SAR, DAR chapter locally has a scholarship for teachers or students, support them. It is exposure to the original is so important.
I will tell you that as the education committee chair for the New Jersey Society of the Sons of the American Revolution, heredity organizations have youth education programs. You go to the DAR, the SAR, and SAR.org, DAR.org, you'll see that there are not only programs for students, but also scholarships and grants for teachers. We have at the, just as an example, since I do the website, the New Jersey Society, njssar.org, you'll see youth programs, and there's a whole list of all of the different programs we do for elementary level, middle school level, high school, teacher grants. And we're not, I mean, there are other organizations as well. The Museum of the American Revolution also has these programs. On the National SAR site, there's a whole teacher resource program. The American Battlefield Trust has a whole teacher resource program. So these are, and it's very interesting, just this year, there was a consortium meeting in Washington, DC of a lot of hereditary organizations and museums to sort of coordinate and share resources. So we now, our hereditary organizations are talking with their local historic sites, both supporting historic preservation. So that's where I didn't want to rattle on, but just to carry on what you were saying, George, I think it's very, very, very important.
Roger, I'd be chagrined if I don't correct myself and say, and very important to these programs is a site in Virginia called Mount Vernon.
Yes,
where they have a phenomenal education department and great teachers programs where teachers can get funded to be there.
And they have a teachers program that's essential, that focuses specifically on women.
Yeah. So that's terrific. So, for everybody in the audience out there, talk to your local schools and let them know that these are out there. Our daughter's a teacher. Teachers are always looking for money. Hereditary organizations are looking to support teachers in their endeavors. To get back to the book, I loved every article. And I, being a public historian in Trenton, I was thrilled with Cynthia Kerner's introduction, which talks about Washington's return to Trenton on his way to the inauguration. The symbolism that she explains in this triumphant entry into the city by the women and the girls in the city seems almost Grecian. The way he's welcomed back into the city. I'm curious how you came upon that particular article as the opening chapter. Where did that decision come from?
Well, Cindy had it, about half our authors were not a part of the symposium at Mount Vernon. Once George and I started thinking about this as a volume, we thought a little more broadly, and we slightly changed the title of the symposium from Women of George Washington's, no, Women in George Washington's World to Women of George Washington's World, right? So we wanted to broaden it. And I immediately knew we had to get Cindy Kerner in there. She's one of the most important women's historians of this time period. I knew she would just really do a phenomenal job for us of writing about something. And so when I first talked to her and I said, oh, we want you to do this. We want you to be a part of this. You're either gonna, intro or close it. What do you want to write about? She said, I don't know, I don't know. So she looked around a little bit and came back very quickly and told George and me, I want to write about these images of the women in Trenton. And of course, this was during COVID when we were putting this book together. So she had to do all of this with only online resources. There were no archives open for her to go to. And she said she just had a tremendous time starting with the images and then going out from the images to talk more broadly about how we can think, what does this tell us about not just George Washington, not just about women, but that whole era more broadly, starting with these images where these women are kind of generic. Every single woman looks the same. They have no names. And she just does an incredibly skillful job of taking that apart and relating it to women's history in general, how difficult it is to do women's history, how long women have been ignored, and how we don't understand the past clearly, accurately, if we don't also look at women. It's a wonderful hook. It's a wonderful way to open the book. I'm so glad that Cynthia
it's marvelous. It's absolutely marvelous. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that was worth the price of admission. So I missed, not to detract at all from the book, but I missed seeing articles about some of my favorites, Katie Green, Lucy Flucker Knox. Did you, when you were talking with these different academics and putting together the articles, did you have a vision of who you wanted in the book, or did they just come to you with who they wanted to write about? George, what was the plan?
We had something of a plan, and one of the things when you're going to edit either a journal or an edited book is it's very important that the person be able to pick it up off their desk and move across the house. When my first book came out, someone said to me, well, you left this and this out. And I said, well, my 200-page book became a 400-page book, and I was committed to not publishing a 500-page book. I have a colleague who told me that his therapist said to him once that she would love to be able to read his books in the bathtub, but it would make her drown. And so there's always that. A lot of it was, we had both a sense from Charlene's scholarship and I suppose my travels, since I've been wandering the country for the last several years working on a book on historic spaces. We both had contacts with and exposure to folks who were writing on various subjects. As in any collection, there were some folks we very much wanted and invited, and they simply weren't available. A couple of the authors we requested already had publishing contracts for their work. A couple were committed, and this is very much, we probably shouldn't whine too loudly on this, but this book is very much a product that came out through COVID. Mm-hmm. So including my initial plan for my chapter, I had intended to spend March and April of 2020 at a site in Virginia going through papers there. Does everyone else remember March and April of 2020?
Yeah.
When none of us left the house. So so that was very much a part of it. So and it was, in part it was who was available, but it's not also, while I would say this is a great contribution, it's by no means the last word. Someone needs to write those women's biographies. I would say get onto a Google search or American History and Life if you have access to a college's databases, and find out what's been written on them. And the great trick with any subject is, do documents exist? I ran into that a lot with my plans for this. are, historians have to have facts. You have to have data, and too many people in the 19th century threw grandma's diaries into the fireplace. So,
but we did. I mean, George and I did think about balance. We didn't want a collection of just elite white women. We didn't want a collection of women everybody already knew a lot about. And we wanted to get historians, and they're not just academics. We're really happy about this work because there's lots of public historians in it as well. And we wanted to get the people who could give us a different view of even the famous women. So that's why we wanted Lynn Price Robbins for Martha Washington.
Right.
Lynn knows Martha's, documents backwards and forwards. She knows her. Same thing with Sarah Georgini and Abigail Adams. Sarah knows Abigail Adams. And so when George and I were kind of thinking about, well, who do we want to add? We were thinking about historians who could give us a different view, a different twist than what was already out there. In addition to those historians writing about women that we don't know very much about, and we should, like Samantha Snyder doing Elizabeth Willing Powell, we should know this woman. Everybody should know who she is. And so we kept, Jim Basker had been a part of the symposium. We definitely wanted to keep his work on Phyllis Wheatley. It's really brilliant, a really different way to look at Phyllis. Mary Thompson's work on interacting, she works at Mount Vernon, interacting with the white women and the enslaved women. And then George came up with a whole brand new essay about enslaved women in the presidential household, because we knew we needed something on that.
Sure.
And so George, we really did think it through. It wasn't just kind of as haphazard as, well, we can't get that person. There were people we wanted and we got them, and it is a nicely balanced work.
Yeah, and one of the things I think this book does do is it kind of blows your mind. If you Roger, you have great passion and expertise, but we find stories that, I was sure I knew everything about Benedict Arnold's treason.
Yeah.
I mean, I've spent 30 years teaching college, and heaven knows I've told that story time and time again. And what Charlene's come up with, including now she's going to Europe and tracking I never thought about the Arnolds having children and children who had children who survived. You don't think about Benedict Arnold reproducing, but he did. And they've still got all these baby Arnolds scattered across Europe now. Or Jim Basker, who I had never met before the symposium, gives us a new take on Washington and Phyllis Wheatley. And I don't know, I'm guessing from the faces I can see, most of us were probably educated in an era when Phyllis Wheatley was not part of the American literary canon. And I remember that being very controversial, and people saying, well, if you're going to teach Phyllis Wheatley, you're going to have to burn the complete works of Mark Twain, which is not the case. But I never knew in his lifetime George Washington wrote one letter to a Black woman, and it was Miss Wheatley. And she is this amazing story.
Let's talk about Phyllis Wheatley a little bit. I just got to make sure everyone's muted here. So her effect on both Washington and the national consciousness. I mean, in his recent tome, David Hackett Fisher posits the contributions of Africans made to the nation's founding, and James Basker's article is a stellar presentation that supports Hackett Fisher's thesis. How much might you attribute Washington's attitude towards Blacks and slavery to Wheatley?
Well, Jim argues that she may be the influence on why Washington chose to free his slaves in his will. I mean, that's where he ends his essay. We can't make the direct connection, but Jim does a phenomenal job of saying this woman was really influential. She was a national celebrity. She really seemed to reach George Washington in a particular way. As George said, right, he wrote her, invited her to come and visit him at camp. Jim and I like to think that that visit actually happened, even though we don't have any record of it. So it's a very, very persuasive argument, I think, that Jim Basker makes, that she's maybe one of the main influences on why he decides to do that. George, do you want to add some?
No, I mean, I think it's just a phenomenal retelling, and I'm Charlene avoids social media, and I spend too much time every day on it, but I'm still stunned that there are folks out today who very much feel that their identity means they need to knock someone else off the historical page. And I try to spend a little time every day defending the curatorial staffs of these phenomenal institutions. And I had someone kvetching at Mount Vernon's curators yesterday online saying, what's the point of going to Mount Vernon? It's just a bunch of stories about the slaves now. And I said, well, they're doing phenomenal, important work looking at the enslaved community. And his response was, I want to know more about the general. And I said, well, I would recommend you go to a library. There are thousands of books available about George Washington. I haven't read thousands of them, but by golly, to survive college and graduate school, I read a bunch. And I'll put in a plug here and say, get to know the bookstore at Mount Vernon, which is one of the best historic site bookstores out there. But I think we're seeing a new understanding and appreciation and expansion. I mean, when I was being educated, they told us the whole thing was to come up with new knowledge and learn things. And the story of Miss Wheatley, or the story of the women who I ended up writing about, the women who came to Philadelphia enslaved in 1790, and were a part of a changing world. I mean, Philadelphia was a slave center. There was a slave market a few streets away from the president's house site.
I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, Ona Judge's story was captured in a popular imagination. Perhaps it was the timing of Erica Armstrong Dunbar's bestseller. But tell us about the African-American population in Philadelphia, George, and both the free and enslaved. Because you had them living side by side. And what do we learn about Washington and his behavior and the dilemma regarding Ona Judge?
Well, this is something that has profoundly changed in the last couple decades. When there was first discussion of building a new building for the Liberty Bell, a couple decades back, some historians, including Ed Lawler, argued, well, if you're going to put this on this site, we have to talk about the fact that literally to walk into the Liberty Bell building, you will walk through the site where George Washington enslaved people. And I am a great lover of the National Park Service, and many of my dearest friends have or still work there. But I will say the Park Service really dropped the ball at that moment. A couple administrators in particular who said, "Oh, we're not going to talk about this. We've made our decision. It's final." And you shouldn't really say, as a federal employee, you shouldn't say, "I've made my decision and it's final to the American people." And I don't think I've tried hard to remember the first time I heard Ona Judge's name, but the Park Service had, among other things, phenomenal interpreters like the late Francis Delmar, and phenomenal historians like Anna Cox Toogood. And I was actually permitted at the height of COVID to be alone in a room with Coxie Toogood's archive that she created to when the President's House site, and that was the basis of my primary sources because all the archives were closed. But Philadelphia had a large free and enslaved population. Enslaved people of African origin were a part of the settlement of the Quaker city from its beginning. Philadelphia very quickly became a major trading center, and one of the commodities coming on those wooden ships were Black people in chains. I know a few years ago, some politicians got very worked up when former First Lady Obama said, "I live in a house built by slaves." And my response anytime someone says something like that is, well, duh, what do you think these folks were doing? It wasn't like they were here on, on a field trip. So to actually get in and try and tell their stories, and it's extremely difficult. One of the reasons I didn't love the quotation I titled my chapter with, but one of the reasons I chose it was, how often do we have the voice of a Black woman in 18th century America? And when Ona Judge, who leaves us one of the first narratives of a formerly enslaved Black woman, writes and says, "I had friends among the colored people of the town," she's giving us a screaming clue as to what the significance of this city where changes were going on. Now, I don't want to go into a lecture, but one of the things we have to acknowledge is that George and Martha Washington attempted to use the power of the presidency, I hesitate to word, unlawfully, but inappropriately, trying to get government employees to seize their runaway, their freedom seeker, as we're calling these folks now. And they failed. And of course, as we know from what I wrote and others wrote in the book, Washington changes over time. You know, one of the things we don't know is why was he unable to convince his wife and his step-grandchildren when he freed all of his slaves? Why didn't they? And this is the most influential man of the century, I think. But he couldn't convince them to do that.
Mm-hmm. So this is women in Washington's world. What you mentioned earlier, the thousands of books that are on Washington. I have to confess, a very good friend of mine just published a most recent biography of George Washington. When David Stewart came to me and said he was writing a biography of George Washington, I scratched my head and I said, "Why, David? I mean, gosh, we have so many. How is yours going to be that different?" And not only was it different, it was really, I thought, one of the best single volume biographies of George Washington out there. I learned so much. Anything that I learned in that book, what I've read in this book, I've learned so much more. I mean, there's just so many aspects of looking at George Washington through the eyes of all these women, and diverse women, as you've presented with all of the contributors, is fascinating. And I think to truly understand the period and this man that we revere, who had obviously many faults, but having put this volume together, what do we learn? What can you tell our audience tonight? What do we learn about George Washington that's new?
Well, to your point, if we think about George Washington's life, probably half the people who surrounded him were women, perhaps more, right? And so very few of them have been incorporated into these thousands of books that have been written about George Washington. Of course, Martha and Abigail Adams show up, but we decided to really think about what does that mean, that Washington was surrounded by women. And he was surrounded by women who loved him, women who cared for him, women who influenced him, women who cared about his political future, the future of the nation. But he was also surrounded by women who frustrated him, who thwarted him, who committed treason against him. He was influenced by women. And I think there's a case to be made that he was as influenced by women as he was by the men in his life. And perhaps if we think about his relationship with Martha, even more influenced. Again, Sam Snyder's brilliant essay on Elizabeth Willing Powell makes clear that she was one of his key political advisors here. So is Abigail Adams. So I would just say, how can you not learn more about George Washington when you decide to look at the women who surrounded him?
One of the things that I loved about the collection we ended up drawing together, I often think of these as sort of a dinner party where I don't think Charlene and I have seen each other face to face since the first person started coughing with COVID. So it's been a Zoom and coffee talk on the phones and editorial plan. But one of the things that I really love as a museum person is that a lady named Anne Bay Godden, who is amongst our senior historians in this. If you're a teacher on here, you may have known Anne as one of the goddesses of teacher education. She was curator of education at Mount Vernon, and before that worked at the Smithsonian. But Anne is working on a biography of Pamela Cunningham, and so much of what we, so much of what we have constructed as citizens and our ideas about this first president, this founding father, come out of this woman who, by every account, normally would be considered insignificant. In an era that worshipped motherhood, she was a single lady, a spinster, they would have said. In a period that talked about robust America, she was an invalid. She was very sickly at times. In an era that allowed women not a single voice, women could not vote at all in this. She influenced politicians and wealthy people and governmental leaders and leading thinkers, published scholars to get behind her in this idea. And in many ways, our construction of what early America looked like it goes back to Miss Cunningham. And Anne did a phenomenal job of unpacking the story. I mean, I think this biography that we've had the pleasure to edit and publish, and her forthcoming book are very, very important work. So one of the things I was told, don't talk about the age of our authors, and I don't really know everybody's age. Charlene is obviously much, much younger than I, but we have a spectrum of experiences that came into this, and so we're all, figuring out our stuff. But I know she doesn't particularly like it, but Samantha Snyder is young enough to be my daughter. And while I thought I knew absolutely everything about Elizabeth Willing Powell, because I used to live in and run her house museum, Sam taught me a great deal. Sam is is trained as a public historian and a librarian, and she has found things in archives that I didn't believe existed. And I think all of our authors, we could say that about. I can't,
I wanted to ask you, I wanted to ask you,
say we didn't have a stinker at lunch, so.
I wanted to ask you about Sarah's paper.
About who, Roger? About,
Yeah.
I missed that.
Sorry, Sarah Giorgini's paper. If you will excuse the phrase, she paints a fascinating portrait of Abigail Adams' relationship with Washington. What are your impressions of her relationship with Martha? And conversely, what are her husband's relationships with Washington?
You mean coming from what Sarah Giorgini was writing about?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think Sarah did an exceptional job of showing how Abigail Adams was a careful observer of both Martha and George Washington. A careful observer and very much aware that they mattered, that being with them mattered, how they were modeling these brand new leadership roles in the nation. She very much understood her place in history as well. And I think seeing herself as very much connected to both Martha and George, she knew she had a lot to learn from them, but she also knew that she could support them. I think Sarah Giorgini does, you're right, she does a good job of painting the portrait of this relationship. The essay's entitled basically that, which is why Roger and I are playing around with that. And making it clear how Abigail Adams knew her role was to also be supportive of them, to watch them, to model them, but to also be supportive of them. And I think Sarah does a very wonderful job in a very short amount of pages to tell us how complicated that relationship was as they set out to literally build the presidency, right? To construct the presidency. She did a great job.
Abigail Adams was really a force of nature. I mean, she was a businesswoman. And one of the things that you show with some of these essays is that Martha was not far behind. I mean, she was also a force of nature with how she managed a corporation, basically. Now, she did it with enslaved people, but I mean, it was amazing at
One of,
her ability.
the great difference between the two is that the Adamses had they produced several children. And very early on in the story, Adams writes to her and says, I want you to go to the shops and buy a leather portfolio and start to keep my letters, because this might be the beginning of an imperial story, like we read about ancient Rome. And she did. And I will tell you all, in one of my trips to the third floor at Mount Vernon, which is not open to the public, but if you're nice to the curators, they'll take you up. But it's impossible to have it widespread open. The stairs are too narrow and such. But after the general died and Lady Washington moved upstairs, the infamous story is she sat there rereading his letters and tossing them into the fireplace in that bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I will admit, I stood there and looked at that now cold fireplace and thought,
oh my God.
Oh, what if I could be at another historical moment, if I could stand there and grab them as they went in, because we don't know, but they had an incredibly important relationship as both of these women.
And I think Lynn Price in her essay really brings Martha Washington to life in a way that she often doesn't. She's just usually portrayed as kind of the wife.
Yeah.
And Lynn Price did a really good job of showing how Martha Washington wasn't just a wife. As Lynn argued, she became a symbol. And she's a morale booster for soldiers. She's, just a committed fundraiser for the revolution. And Lynn, given the fact that lots of Martha's letters are gone, Lynn did a wonderful job, I think, of bringing her to life and making clear how important she is. She's not just the wife of George Washington, but looking at her as a woman and her own actions in the revolution. And again, this is what this volume is all about, is moving women from the sidelines into the center when we think about the revolution and the new nation. And Lynn does that's what I mean by new twist on some of these women. And both Abigail Adams and Martha Washington get a new twist. I would argue Kate Hallman does that for Mary Ball Washington too. We kind of forget about the mother of the father, which is the title of her essay, and looking at how important the memory of the mother of the father was in the 19th century gives us a new sense of how important George Washington was, and how important women as mothers were to the new nation as well.
Well, and that was fascinating with her article too about Mary Ball Washington, because you go deep into the early republic and how the mother of the father, as she points out in her article, begins to build the myth. And you talk about Parson Weems and how Parson Weems presents George Washington, and how her grave even became a series of a controversy. I wanted to ask you, since it wasn't in anybody's footnotes, I wasn't going to say anything, but we now have one of the members of the audience ask the same question, so I'll throw it out to you. Cokie Roberts' book, Founding Mothers, came out, I don't know, 24 years ago, I guess, and it was a huge bestseller. What's your impression of that book?
It's a huge bestseller, and it got a lot of people interested in women in this time period, and so that's always marvelous, right? That she really ignited some renewed interest in these women, and who doesn't like that, right? That was really useful.
She probably, I was a great admirer and lover of her work growing up in Indiana. NPR was the lifeline to a bigger world. And I remember her voice with great sentimentality, and have to admit, I was at the Fellows Cottage at Mount Vernon, I think the week she died. We lost her way too soon. And she had stayed in the cottage there, and she had left a copy of Founding Mothers, or one of her other books, with a long note written into it. And I took it over to the archive and said, someone's going to walk away with this. This has to go. This needs to be under lock and key. Cokie is very important.
Yeah.
And I think what she was, I learned a few years back, someone wrote a review of my first book in French, and I learned the word, the French term, which doesn't translate quite well, but the vulgarisation. And I thought they told me I was being a vulgar historian, but what they meant, what my best friend is a French historian, and he said, no. It's like Voltaire making Locke make sense to the greater people. And Roberts was a superb journalist who probably doesn't go, I hesitate to use the word theory because some people hear it and just have a visceral reaction, but she probably doesn't go as deeply into the theory as our texts do.
Well,
but she was a popular history and
more as deeply into the archives. This is what I really liked about our contributors.
Right.
There's so much archival work, so much careful archival work. It's filled with so many primary sources. And that's what George and I really wanted to have happen too, is to have people go in to primary sources and look at them with new eyes. And everybody did that.
I mean, if we look at the biographies of our authors, Giorgini and Robbins, or Price Robbins, are both documentary editors who have literally, they're taking the original documents and editing them, footnoting them, and publish them. And we've just, Lynn Price Robbins' edition of the papers of Martha Washington came out the same week we did on this. And we've also seen scholars who have spent a lifetime immersed in original sources.
Mm-hmm.
And a Godden, Mary Thompson, who has just retired from Mount Vernon and becomes historian emerita now, has, her work is phenomenal. I've never understood, Mary, I don't think has slept because she's produced phenomenal works on the Washington's religion and the Washington's relationship with their enslaved workers. And, I say, how on earth do you also, she tells the story that for Washington's, the bicentennial of his death, one of her roles was to take handmade bandages and paint them with red ink as if Washington were dying of consumption or the throat disease that he had. And she did all of that and somehow had time to publish. And Jim Basker, who is a leader of the field. If you don't know about the Gilder Lehrman Institute, learn more about it. But
well, I mean, I asked the question, and you whoops, somebody else's. We seem to get some noise here. I asked the question specifically to talk about this idea of primary source material. You're right. I mean, Cokie Roberts was a marvelous journalist. I've gotten to the point now in my reading. Well, I got to this point many years ago. When I pick up a book, I start looking at the footnotes the footnotes in the bibliography before I actually look at the chapters, because I want to see, where the information is coming from. And a lot of times I will read a book and start reading the book and then start reading the footnotes and the books that are contributing to that. And, but she was a great storyteller. What I find so terrific about women in Washington's world is that, as you mentioned it right up at the top of the program, academics and public historians, it's a marvelous mix. This is not a heady brainiac book that is going to give you a headache to read. You all tell great stories. And at the same time, the sources that you use are these primary sources that you bring to us are rich, and I think it's terrific. I mentioned earlier about Katie Green and Lucy Knox. I think that's probably going to be volume 2. So let's get to it. Before we finish up here, I've got to learn more, Charlene, about what you're writing or what you're learning about Peggy Shipman, or should I say Margaret Shippen. And you say this is a book that you're working on now. What's the plan?
Well, it's going to be a biography of Peggy Shippen Arnold. Unfortunately, she died early, so it won't be a terribly long book. She died when she was 41 years old. But we've been talking about how primary sources matter. And when I decided to look to see what had been written about Peggy Arnold, I was amazed to discover that there were no scholarly works on Peggy Arnold. There was no scholarly biography. It's like, great, here's my chance, right? And now there's not a lot. There's almost nothing left from the years when she was married to Benedict. There's lots of missing letters, and I think the family did that on purpose, right? But she proves the point that we're trying to make with this volume, that when you move a woman to the center of the story, instead of just on the sides, you get a whole new take on the story. So when you look at the treason or look at her entire wife, it completely rewrites that treason. And when you actually go back and look at the primary sources, which a lot of historians haven't, they think they know this story. They think they know this story of Benedict Arnold. They think they know how it all worked. But if you back up a little bit and you actually go and look at the sources, and you go and look at sources that the established biographies of Benedict kind of have stopped looking at because they're just using the easy published things, you can get a different sense of what is happening and the way that story is unfolding. And it's abundantly clear that she was a part of it, if that's what you want to know.
That is absolutely clear. Absolutely. What do you have a projected date when you're turning in the manuscript?
I do. It's already under contract with Norton. COVID, of course, slowed me down a little bit, but the whole project, fingers crossed, right, coming out 2026 in time for the 250th celebrations for the American Revolution. So
sounds terrific. George,
yeah, just got to get some research done.
George, what are you working on?
I am working on a long delayed book called Interpreting Historic Sites, about how we use historic spaces to understand the past. This is what I spent 6 months working on at Mount Vernon. Of course, they are a phenomenal historic site with great curators and architects and et cetera, and an amazing interpretive staff who have in a lot of ways changed the way we look at these spaces. And I am very envious of these people who say, oh, I've loved COVID. I locked myself in my house for 7 months and banged out a 400-page manuscript. And I say, I didn't. I stripped furniture and my garden flourished during it. But I'm very hopeful to be able to get back to doing field work, site research, late summer, early fall, and get this book, long delayed book out.
That sounds fascinating. I've just come back from Savannah, as I mentioned, and my wife and I visited the Owens Thompson mansion in Savannah, and they are still operating on COVID mode, meaning that their docents and interpreters are not showing guests visitors through the mansion, but they've done it all on an app. You download, you just listen to it on your phone. It was spectacular. The way they set that up, the listening posts that you went to and the interpretation that they gave you was just magnificent, and it falls right in line with what you're saying. And as we approach the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration, obviously all of this is going to be important. You know, not just shooting off firecrackers and having hot dogs, but who are we? What do we mean? And what did all of this really mean? And to everybody who is listening tonight, I encourage you, please, to you can go to History Author Talks, and you can see a collection of books that I've put there. Proceeds donate the SAR library, but you should also just go to wherever you buy books and have them get your copy of Women in Washington's World. It is a rich collection, and George and Charlene have done a marvelous job putting this book together. And with that, I want to say thank you to them for all of their hard work. Please extend my congratulations to all of your contributors, and to all of you for joining us once again on History Author Talks. I will be sending a notice out for my program in August, where Maxine Laurie from from Seton Hall actually is going to be talking about choosing sides in revolutionary New Jersey. How did families determine whether they were going to be loyalist or patriot or whatever we called them, and how many times that changed during the course of the conflict? So that's our next program coming up in August. So with that, I'll say goodnight to everybody, and thank you so much to all of you.
Roger, thank you, and thank you all. This was a
Terrific.
great pleasure, and as I've called her for the last 2 years, it was amazing to work with the hardest working woman in show business.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.